Good evening. I'm Jennifer Van Vleck, Assistant Professor of History and the organizer of the Yale International History Workshop. I would first like to thank the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism and the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs for their generous co-sponsorship of this talk. I'm honored to introduce my esteemed colleague, Timothy Snyder, as the inaugural speaker for this year's International History Workshop. Dr. Snyder is the Housum Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He received his doctorate at the University of Oxford in 1997. He has written several award-winning books, including The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569 to 1999. Sketches from a Secret War, a Polish artist's mission to liberate Soviet Ukraine. The Red Prince, the secret lives of a Habsburg Archduke. And Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. Bloodlands, published in 2010, won 12 awards. It has been translated into 30 languages and was a bestseller in 6 countries. And I should note that Professor Snyder reads 10 European languages and speaks 5. This year, Professor Snyder received an inaugural Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, as well as the Havel Foundation Prize. He is a member of the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he sits on the advisory councils of several other scholarly and nonprofit organizations. His most recent book, and the subject of this talk, is Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning, which was published earlier this month. A current bestseller and a New York Times editor's pick, Black Earth has also been longlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize, the United Kingdom's most prestigious nonfiction award. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Snyder.
So when we think and talk and read and write about the Holocaust today, it's very often as a matter of remembering, of commemoration, of looking for round numbers to commemorate, of seeking survivors, finding stories. I worry that this is a trail that is fading into wilderness. I'm concerned that the politics of commemoration lead us too closely back to the politics of identity. I worry that when we treat the Holocaust as a matter of memory, rather than as a matter of history, we give ourselves answers that are too easy. Of course, it's right to think that we as individuals should be concerned about our own attitudes and the attitudes of others. Of course, that's part of the lesson of the history of the Holocaust. But I wondered if it was enough. And now I'm convinced that it's not. The case that I'd like to make in the next 45, 50 minutes or so is that there is a history to the Holocaust which can be understood. That the history that we might understand is rather different than the history that we generally remember. And that if we get it right, the lessons that we draw for the present and the future would be different lessons than the ones we draw now. And that's important because whether we like it or not, we are already drawing lessons from the Holocaust. We do it all the time. But what if we understand the Holocaust incompletely or even incorrectly? Then we've drawn the wrong lessons and we may be accelerating disaster rather than preventing it. So having said that, let me try to make a case for what I think are the causes of the Holocaust. This is not going to be a talk about memory. This is not going to be a talk about culture. This is going to be a talk about interpretation. This is going to be an essay, an attempt at interpretation. Now, I have 3 hosts. I've been invited by the International History Workshop. I've been invited by the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. I've been invited by the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. What I would like to do in a way is to justify these 3 invitations. I would like to begin by speaking about anti-Semitism. I would like to move forward to make a case for international history as a way to understand the Holocaust, and then conclude with a word about what this might all mean for public policy. Okay, so to begin with anti-Semitism. It is a commonplace that in order to understand the Holocaust, one must begin with Hitler. But returning to the primary sources, rereading Mein Kampf, rereading the second book, rereading the speeches, the addresses, I noticed a coherence, a total quality to the ideas, which I hadn't noticed before, and which I think perhaps eludes us in general. And I'd like to begin with that. I'd like to begin with a short summary of what Hitler's anti-Semitism actually was. And this is important because when one considers Hitler's anti-Semitism, it's not just a matter of someone being more anti-Semitic than other people, right? It's not just a transitive issue. This person is more anti-Semitic, this is more anti-Semitic, this is more anti-Semitic. It's not like that. There are qualitative differences in the kinds of anti-Semitism that people believe in, that people work from. And in Hitler's case, what we have is what I would think of as a planetary anti-Semitism, a chain of reasoning at the end of which there's only one possible conclusion, and that is the eradication of the Jews. But what's the chain of reasoning? The chain of reasoning is interesting. Hitler starts from the premise that we as human beings are races, that races are like species, and what species do is compete for land and food so they can propagate. He takes that as being the only true thing about the world. It's a law of nature, he says in Mein Kampf, like a law of physics. It's as certain, he says, as the law of gravity. Why might we think otherwise? Why might we be under the impression that friendship or love or marriage or law or the state or a political party or any other commitment to human reciprocity exists, has weight, matters, or should matter? Why might we think such things? The answer, Hitler says, is the Jews. The Jews are responsible, and this is the radical character of Hitler's claim, the Jews are responsible for every idea of human reciprocity which distracts us from racial solidarity. From Hitler's point of view, all we should be doing is recognizing who belongs to our race and who does not, and fighting on behalf of our race against everyone else, taking land from everyone else, starving them to death, propagating on what had been their territory. That is all we should be doing. Any intellectual distraction from that, says Hitler, is Jewish. Any. So Christianity and communism, say Hitler, are fundamentally the same idea, right? St. Paul, says Hitler, is the same person as Leon Trotsky, right? Because any idea, whether it's working class solidarity or Christian mercy, which allows people to engage each other as human beings, is of Jewish origin, right? Whether it's a contract, a legal contract, right? Or whether it's membership in the Socialist Party, ideas which seem contradictory on the surface are for Hitler all of a piece. Any idea which allows you to see one another as members of humanity as opposed to members of a race must be Jewish. Now, this has the conclusion, and Hitler spells it out quite explicitly at the end of chapter 2 of Mein Kampf and in other places, that the only way to restore human nature, the only way to restore the planet is to eradicate the Jews. The Jews are, Hitler says, a spiritual pestilence, geistliche Pestilenz, and he means that literally. They infect the soul. And the only way to restore the soul, the only way to make people what they ought to be, then, is to completely get rid of the Jews. They have to be removed somehow from the planet. Now, one other idea for which Hitler assigns the Jews responsibility, which we very often overlook, is science. So we have the habit, I think the bad habit, of understanding the Holocaust or Auschwitz as some kind of height of scientific or technological achievement. It would be better, I think, to begin from the passages of Mein Kampf, where Hitler explicitly says that the idea that science can save us from resource war is a Jewish swindle, that it's a Jewish lie. He's very explicit that any hope that one has for science to save us from the fundamental competition over land and food, which is our fate, that idea too is Jewish. Just like Christian mercy, just like communist revolution, that is also a Jewish idea. In fact, in perhaps understandably, oft forgotten and neglected passages of Mein Kampf, Hitler explicitly says that the hybridization of grains, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation, that these things will not save us. In other words, the entire package of technology that was being developed mainly in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, which after the war was going to become the Green Revolution and create the world of bounty in which we all grew up, most of us grew up, all of us know, that created that world of bounty, he'd specifically denied those things, right? Specifically denied that technology could save us. Now, this is very important because if technology could save us, if science could save us, then there would be no reason for resource war to be human destiny. So Hitler specifically denies that possibility. What he offers instead, and now I'm moving towards a difficult problem of translating these ideas into practice. What he offers instead is a kind of substitute for science. What he offers instead is the idea of Lebensraum, living space. Lebensraum is the alternative to science. What Hitler does is he argues that, in fact, if you're experiencing anxiety about food, that's right. If you're experiencing a sense of catastrophe, that's correct. We have to welcome ecological panic because that is in fact the authentic human experience of the world. Panic is absolutely normal. Any idea that you ought not to be panicking about shortages has been put in your head by Jews, right? So panic is normal, and the resolution to panic is what he calls Lebensraum. The thing which will work when science doesn't work is Lebensraum. Now, what does he mean by Lebensraum? Well, in general, you know what he means. It means habitat. It means what we might say now is ecological niche. Lebensraum is a space where a certain group of people, another race, lives. And in the simplest form, this idea just means that Germans should go to someone else's habitat, starve them out, take their land, and propagate. That's the simplest version. But in a more specific version, Lebensraum intersects with his general ideas about Jews. Because one of his notions, and it's a popular idea then, and it remains surprisingly popular now, one of his ideas was that Jews were communists and communists were Jews. This was called, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, this was called the Judeo-Bolshevik idea, or the Judeo-communist idea. The Jews are communists and communists are Jews. Now, what that means is that there's a specific political construction, the Soviet Union, which is in Eastern Europe, which is going to be vulnerable. Why? It's vulnerable because it's a Jewish state. And if Germany seeks its living space in the East against the Soviet Union, there's a kind of double opportunity. The Soviet Union will crack upon contact with Germany because it's just a Jewish state. And so a war will have been won against Jewish world domination and destroying the Soviet Union. But meanwhile, Germany will be able to seize the fertile territory of Ukraine, which is the specific geographical location of Lebensraum. Ukraine was, and remains incidentally, one of the most fertile territories in the world. And the idea was that Ukraine would allow Germany to become self-sufficient, it would allow Germans to become prosperous, and it would move Germany into the ranks of the world economic and political powers. So the conquest of Ukraine would change Germans. Now, here we take a step even closer to politics, right? So maybe you're beginning to feel the appeal of responding to anxiety, right? Maybe you can understand a little bit how a country such as Germany, which did not in fact feed itself, and could not, in fact, have fed itself from its own territory without giving up its industry. A country which had been blockaded during the First World War, and indeed after the First World War, by the Entente powers. A country which had to rely on inherently unreliable international markets for food. Why a sense of anxiety might, in fact, resonate. That's one step towards politics. Here's the next step. Lebensraum has another meaning. The other meaning of Lebensraum, aside from habitat, is something more like living room. So what we would say in American English, living room, a comfortable place, a place where you might take your meals, a place where you could put your feet up, where the slippers are, or maybe the fireplace is. The Lebensraum, in this sense, incidentally, is still used in Austrian German, although not so much in German German, which is just one example of many of that kind of linguistic history. So Lebensraum has another meaning. I don't just mention this as a kind of semantic curiosity. I mention it because it's inherent in the use of the word itself. When Hitler talks about Lebensraum, he is simultaneously saying two things. He is saying, we must struggle to destroy inferior races and take their land in order to survive, right? So he's arousing what we might call survivalist emotions. At the same time, what he is saying is, and literally at the same time, in the same sentence, or in the next sentence, he is saying, we must take other people's land in order to have a high standard of living. In order to have a standard of living which is not lower than that of the United States of America, which is a connection that he makes extremely explicitly, and one must admit intelligently, in the second book, where he says that Europeans look, thanks to radio and other technologies, look for their ideas of standard of living, not to the real possibilities of their own lives, but to America. right? And what he says, and here what he says is very similar to a whole lot of French theory that people of my generation had to read in college. What he says is standard of living is inherently subjective and it's inherently relative. It's not a matter of satisfying people physically. It's not a matter of a certain number of calories. It's a matter of believing that you're not behind anyone else. So this is the second definition of a Lebensraum, and Hitler explicitly means this. He says it explicitly, that this is what he has in mind. So he's combining two things. Other people must die in very large numbers, but far away from us, so that we at home can not just survive, but have prosperity. And of course, in Hitler's writings, there's a very clearly gendered element to this, right? Men must go and kill far away in order to satisfy the inherently insatiable desire of their wives for a certain standard of living, right? And so there are two ideas of insatiability at play here. We are insatiable because as a race, we need ever more territory, ever more food in order to propagate, right? So our instinct, our basic animal instinct is insatiable. And then there's another insatiability, which is a human insatiability, a political insatiability, or consumer insatiability, or very often one feels in Hitler's writings a female insatiability. We're insatiable because no standard of living is actually high enough, right? So long as we can look across the Atlantic Ocean and see someone else who might be living better, we're not satisfied. So we're also insatiable in that way. So Lebensraum has to accumulate. There has to be more and more and more. This can never end. This is what history looks like, whether it's a biological history or whether it's a political history. And I hope by now you're beginning to feel the politics come a little bit closer, right? Because the notion that standard of living is relative is one that we experience every day. The idea that people somewhere far away can suffer so that we can have a high standard of living, whether we like it or not, is not so distant, right, from the way that we actually exist. So in these ways, I'm trying to help us get through what I take to be a very difficult problem, which is how you connect Hitler's anti-Semitic ideas to political practice, right? Very often what happens in discussions of the Holocaust is a shortcut is taken. One says, well, it was all about anti-Semitism, and one refers to Hitler. Fine. But that actually isn't the answer. That's the question. The question is, how could ideas that are so radical, which were not in fact all that popular in Germany or anywhere else, how could ideas that are so radical actually come to inform policy, right? The answer to the question of how the Holocaust happened is not anti-Semitism. That's only part of the question. We have to work our way from that radical view into German politics, into human sensibilities, and then beyond Germany. So this brings me to the question of Germany. In the familiar way in which the Holocaust is recounted, we spend most of our time working through Hitler's rise to power in 1933, then the so-called Gleichschaltung, making the German state more appropriate for Nazi models, and then we go into the Second World War. What I want to suggest is that there's a different way that we ought to be conceiving of this, and this has to do with what Hitler says about the state. And here again, I'm now going to try to break what I take to be a common misunderstanding about the Holocaust. When we think about the Holocaust, we have a tendency to say the Holocaust was one repressive policy, among others, carried out by a strong state, which cataloged its citizens, bureaucratized them, administered them in a repressive way, concentrated them, and killed them. It's a very powerful narrative, which comes from Raoul Hilberg, it comes from Hannah Arendt, it comes from Zygmunt Bauman in different ways. What I want to try to suggest is that this is basically wrong. At the level of theory, what Hitler says about the state is actually very interesting. Hitler says that the race cannot sacrifice its fundamental goals on the altar of the state. Hitler says, in the natural play of the racial struggle, state borders will dissolve. In other words, he does not see the state, even the German state, as something permanent or even as something very important. The state is something which happens to be there, but like everything else, it's there to be manipulated in the service of the race. And by the way, the same is true for the German nation. I think we make a mistake when we think, okay, Hitler was a nationalist like other nationalists, but more so. That's not how Hitler wrote about the German nation. What Hitler said was, German nationalism exists, and it is a tool which we can use to propel Germans into war, right? He didn't care about the German folk as such. He believed that German national identity was a political instrument that one could use to throw the Germans into a war in which they would become themselves, in which they would return to their racial essence. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What I want to talk about now is the state. Because if we can take a step back from the moment-by-moment narration of Germany in the 1930s, which has been done extremely well. If we can take a step back from that and take Hitler's ideas seriously, we notice something which is very important. There is a basic contradiction between a racial anarchist like Hitler and the seizure of power. Right? If you happen to be, I don't mean you personally, but if you happen to be a racial anarchist, taking control of a state is actually a kind of problematic, complicated, almost contradictory endeavor, because your whole worldview, as you've expressed it in a very long book, is that states don't really matter, ideas aren't really solid, the only thing which matters is racial conflict. So how do you solve then this dilemma of taking control of a state, or of trying to take control of a state? And here's where things get interesting, because Hitler solves this problem, and in my view, this may be the most important element of his politics in the 1930s. Think about the SS. Think about the SA. Take seriously their self-definition as racial institutions. Don't look at their uniforms and think of them as paramilitaries or as para-state organizations. They're not. Think of them seriously as racial institutions. Consider the role that they take in Hitler's rise to power. What they do is they discredit existing state institutions by their street fighting, by their brawling, by breaking the law. They discredit the state. They break down the notional Weberian monopoly on violence. And they do it on purpose, and that helps the Nazis to come to power. Okay, but this is precisely the dilemma. If you come to power with a racial ideology, with the help of racially self-defining groups, what do you do once you have power? Because if those groups are consistent, if they behave consistently with their own ideas, the revolution should continue. The revolution should devour itself, in fact. It should destroy the German state, because it's against states, in fact. And this I think, is the inner meaning of a very well-known event in German history, the Night of the Long Knives. The Night of the Long Knives, as you might remember, is the moment when the SS defeats the SA. It's the moment when the leadership of the SA is exposed as supposedly corrupt, homosexual, and so on. Many of them are killed, many of them are tried, and the SS comes to the fore. The inner meaning of this is as follows. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, were the people who really thought that the revolution is going to go on. They were the people who took these racial ideas seriously in an almost naive way. They were talking about a second revolution after 1933. The SS proposed something different. What the SS proposed was, we will maintain some kind of law in Germany itself, and later on, we will export the racial potential abroad. And this is the secret to Germany in the 1930s. It's this resolution of this tension. The SS remains a racial, anti-political organization. They are biding their time. They are penetrating the police. They are preparing the way to destroy other people's states. If you think about it this way, the concentration camp then takes on a different significance. Because what is a concentration camp? The concentration camps were run by the SS. That was the main thing they did in Germany in the 1930s. What is a concentration camp? All lawyers should know this, especially American lawyers. A concentration camp is a zone without law. By definition, a zone without law. If you think about it that way, the concentration camp in Germany is not so much a zone of exception or only a zone of exception. It is an example of what you're going to do once you get beyond Germany, right? Because in effect, when the war starts, what Germany is going to do is to declare whole countries, thousands of square miles, to be lawless zones. And that's going to create some of the conditions which are going to make the Holocaust possible. At this point, you're probably thinking the notes are for a different lecture, but no, they're actually for this lecture. So this is where we have to move into. So that was anti-Semitism. Now we have to move into international history, because one can make the case that abstractly, right, Hitler's ideas were anti-state. One can make the case inside Germany that what was happening in the 1930s was not so much just the takeover of a state, but the accumulation of potential to destroy other states, which I think is the right way to think about it. The buildup of the Wehrmacht was the accumulation of potential to destroy other states, and the privileging and the support of the SS was was the preparation for what you do when those states are defeated militarily. You then destroy them as nations. You destroy them as political units. Okay, but that's all abstract. How does it work concretely? Concretely, Hitler's basic idea of how to engage in international affairs, as we've already seen, is to destroy the Soviet Union. That is the big move, okay? So all of the things which we in the West really like to remember a lot, like the Battle of Britain or the landing at Normandy or the French resistance or whatever it might be, whatever was fetishized, in your particular high school, these things do not matter from Hitler's point of view. They are all distractions. They are distractions. They're distractions from the main goal. What Hitler is trying to do between 1938 and 1941 is get to a position of fighting the Soviet Union. In fact, he's trying to do it from 1933. And this is the missing part of the story often, because it has to do with Polish-German diplomacy, and Polish history, especially Polish international history, disappeared behind the Iron Curtain at a certain point. But something very interesting is going on. So imagine for a minute that you are in the German General Staff. I'm looking around for actual members of the German. No, okay. So imagine for a minute that you're in the German General Staff. You're looking at the world from Berlin. You know that the main political goal of your leader is the destruction of the Soviet Union. There's a country in between you and the Soviet Union. That country is Poland. It has a pretty decent-sized army. What do? Hitler issues pretty clear instructions about this beginning in 1934. The basic idea is that Poland is going to be either an ally or a benign neutral in a war against the Soviet Union. And the Germans consistently, from 1933 until the end of 1938, tried to recruit Poland for a war against the Soviet Union. And where Polish and German relations break is precisely at the end of 1938, early 1939, when the Poles, when forced to give an answer, will you or will you not ally with us in the war against the Soviet Union, finally say no. Now, from the Polish point of view, what had been going on is that they had been trying to keep the Germans uncertain for as long as possible, because Polish policy was that we are keeping an equal distance between Germany and the Soviet Union on the logic, reasonable, but in the end tragically false, on the logic that Germany can't start a war without us, because we're between, and the Soviets also can't start a war without us, because we're in between. So that is the Polish logic. But there's also another difference. The Germans negotiating with the Poles, and by the Germans I mean high-level people such as Goering and occasionally Hitler himself, are making the case to the Poles that a war against the Soviet Union is also the way to resolve the Jewish question. Now, the Poles are afraid of the Soviet Union, and they are also talking, the Polish leadership is also talking about a Jewish question or a Jewish problem. In fact, it is Poland's explicit policy after 1935 to find a way to rid itself of 90% of its Jewish population. Given that there were more than 3 million Jews in Poland, that's a very large number that we're conjuring with. But what the Poles did not understand is how you combined a war against the Soviet Union with getting rid of the Jews. That was the thing they could not understand, because from their point of view, the way to get rid of the Jews was, and this is where things get interesting, and I spend some time in the book telling this story because it's largely unknown. The way to get rid of the Jews was to support right-wing Jewish terrorists who were going to make a lot of trouble in Palestine so that there could be a Jewish state. Now, that's interesting, okay? That's interesting. That as part of the prehistory of Israel, that's interesting. But for the argument, it's important, and here's why. From the Nazi point of view, anti-Semitism is part of this racial anarchy, right? The Nazi anti-Semitic view is that the Jews are the ones who are in the way of a racial struggle, which is non-political. The Polish point of view is different. The Polish point of view is very much attached to the state. They don't understand that the Nazis are about racial anarchy. They don't get that. But what they do understand is that the way to handle whatever problem they're defining, even what they see as the struggle against Jews, is by way of states. Right? So you either negotiate with the British, or behind their back, you find a way to create a state in Palestine, and then you can get the Jews sent off there. So this actually is one of the factors that leads to the Second World War, because Germany proposes to Poland a joint attack, and in the end, Poland says no. Okay, now why have I spent all this time on this? Well, partly because I want to emphasize the point that there are different kinds of anti-Semitism, right? That it's not just a matter of turning up a dial or turning down a dial or answering like, who is more anti-Semitic, the Poles or the Germans, or something like that. There are issues of quality here which matter, especially when the quality has to do with the state. And we'll see more about that, why that's true soon. But where we've gotten to in history is the moment where Germany starts to destroy states, where this theory of state destruction actually becomes practice, where the SS are allowed out of Germany. Because remember, inside Germany, what the SS can do to the German population is actually rather limited. The concentration camps are terrible places, but there are a few thousand inmates. It's only when the SS gets beyond Germany, beyond German law institutions' practices, that the SS begins to do truly radical things. So let me now take a slight step back. Austria falls apart in March of 1938, the Anschluss. This means that suddenly lots of Austrian Jews are no longer citizens. They're forced to scrub the streets. Tens of thousands of them are basically expatriated very quickly from Austria. Why is that so interesting? It's interesting because in about 6 weeks, Austrian Jews suffer about as much as German Jews had done in the previous 6 years. And that is despite the fact that in Austria there were no Nuremberg laws. There was no political, legal discrimination of Jews. But basically from one day to the next, with the end of the Austrian state, Jews lost their protection from the state. And then you can do things with them that you could not do in Germany, right? That's interesting. There was a limit to that, ironically, because Austria was brought into Germany itself. And the moment that Austria was joined to Germany, then things had to actually calm down rather than accelerate. Czechoslovakia is destroyed over the course of 1938 and 1939. By this time, Jews know what's coming. They know that the civil code is going to go away. They sell their property. They run. So the state destruction of Czechoslovakia leads to a similar consequence. But Poland, this is where I'm going with this. Poland is special because Poland is where Hitler finally gets his war. It's not the war he had wanted. It's not a war he had planned. It's not a war that he expected. But when he made war against Poland, it was the first war that he prosecuted while actively destroying the state. When he talks to his high officers in July, August 1939, right before the war, August 1939, early September 1939, what he tells them is that this war is not like other wars. It's not about territory. It's not about victory. It's not about seizing a certain amount of land. It's about destroying Poland as a state and as a nation. As a state and as a nation. In other words, not just about destroying the Polish army, but about coming into the country, declaring that the civil code no longer functions, the Polish state does not exist. This is where it gets interesting. The Polish state has never existed, right? So the claim that they make when they enter Poland is basically the same kind of claim that European imperialists made beyond Europe. Right? That the territory we're entering is uninhabited, at least in the sense of uninhabited by political beings. So Poland is treated colonially in the sense that the Polish state is not acknowledged as an institution, actively not acknowledged. And the people who are thought to represent it, whether they are military officers, whether they are civilian politicians, whether they are Roman Catholic priests, are physically eliminated, killed in the tens of thousands. And that's not an accident. That's part of the idea of destroying the Polish state. Now, the destruction of the Polish state, then, this new radical step, moves the final solution forward. It allows for things that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. In this situation, for example, something like a ghetto is possible. So when you think of the ghetto, you may think about it in terms of terrible images and human suffering, and that's all true. But from a lawyerly point of view, the ghetto is a violation of property rights. Okay? It's a violation of habeas corpus. What happens to the Jews is the moment where the Polish civil code goes away, they no longer have the right to remain where they are. That may seem like an almost trivializing way to look at the ghetto, but it's actually very important. The Germans deliberately take away rights from everyone, which means that anything is possible. When Jews are taken to the ghetto, that means they lose the right to live where they lived in that part of the city or in the surrounding countryside. And it means that other people can take their property, which is extremely important, right? Because that means that millions of people are immediately implicated in a certain way in what's happening, if only in the very simple sense, which turns out to be pretty fundamental, of not wanting their Jewish neighbors to come back. The German destruction of the Polish state opens the path towards this settlement. It opens the path towards ghettos. It makes things possible that hadn't been possible before. But I'm going to note something which is interesting. The German invasion of Poland is in September 1939. The Germans don't invade the Soviet Union until almost 2 years later, to June of 1941. In those intervening 2 years, Jews suffer. Tens of thousands of Jews die. Mostly these are Jews from the countryside who have to come to the cities, who have to come to the ghettos, who don't have personal connections. That's the key factor. If you come from the countryside, you tend to lose everything, and also you tend not to know anybody in this new ghetto where you arrive. And those are the people in the huge majority who die. And the figures are in the tens of thousands in Warsaw, which is something like 60,000 in Warsaw, which is a horrible figure. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this is not yet a Holocaust. The Germans are not actually taking Jews out in large numbers and killing them. Jews are dying, but the way that they're dying is not yet this thing that we think of as a Holocaust. And this is where I want to stop and pause and just emphasize this point. You can go all the way through German history, all the way up to 1939. From 1933 to 1939 in Germany, the total number of Jews killed is about 200, right? So the first 6 years of Hitler's power, the total number of Jews killed is about 200. You can even go into the war in Poland and the creation of the ghetto, and the total number of Jews who die is in the high tens of thousands, right, before the war in the Soviet Union, which is awful, but it is not yet the Holocaust. And what I'm trying to resist is the kind of story which says things kind of just got worse and worse and worse, and somehow we slipped into mass killing. What I'm trying to claim is that they did not slip into mass killing, that there was a particular moment which was a turning point for reasons which I'm going to try to explain, and that turning point is the invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, there's some reasons that we all know why the invasion of the Soviet Union would be important, why it might be critical. The Germans fought the Soviets in what they called a war of extermination, Vernichtung. The idea from the very beginning, from Mein Kampf forward, was the destruction of the Soviet Union, the enslavement of its peoples, the starvation of its peoples, the seizure of its territories. Germany invades the Soviet Union with the largest armed force ever assembled in the history of the world. That armed force is followed by Einsatzgruppen, who are tasked to kill the Soviet political classes, a point I'm going to return to in a moment. There are reasons why we would expect all of that to accelerate mass killing. But there's another reason which often gets overlooked, and that has to do with politics. And it's going to take me a while to explain it, but it's interesting, I think it's important. It has to do with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Okay. Now, even if you have read a lot of books about the Holocaust, you may not know much about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I'm just going to make an interesting point, just a point I think is interesting. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is how the Second World War began, right? It's the agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany which began the Second World War. We might have had a Second World War that began in a different way. In fact, it began with a Soviet-German agreement called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Nevertheless, if you read the history of the Holocaust, even if you're very, very deeply immersed in it, you won't know about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because it's usually not even mentioned. Or if it's mentioned as an afterthought. And I think here we're right at the nexus of a basic problem in the literature, which I'm going to try to solve in the next 45 seconds. Okay? So the basic problem is this. When Germany invades the Soviet Union, okay? It's easy to cover this with images, right? It's a massive war of extermination. It's very easily, it almost exceeds the imagination. And when you read prose about this moment, June 22nd, 1941, it's very often like the prose is so broad and so grandiose that you forget what's actually at play. What's actually at play? When the Germans invade the Soviet Union, they're not invading the Soviet Union. They're not invading the Soviet Union. They're invading territories that the Soviet Union has just taken from Poland, and they're invading the Baltic states. Okay? The first few days and weeks of the invasion are not in the pre-war Soviet Union. They're in territories which the Soviet Union has just invaded. Now, we struggle with this. We struggle and struggle and struggle because geography is not our strong suit. And the Europeans struggle and struggle and struggle because Polish geography is not their strong suit. But this is really important. Because what it means is that when the Germans invade the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, what they are encountering is territory where the Soviets have themselves just invaded, and where the Soviets have themselves just carried out policies of state destruction, which are actually rather mature, rather efficient, and rather well carried out compared to the German equivalents. It's not that the Soviet intentions are worse, I wouldn't want to say that, but their practices are actually rather more effective than the German ones. So when the Germans arrive, they're encountering a Sovietized population. They're encountering a population where the elites have already been murdered or deported. They're encountering a situation where, this is important, expropriation has already happened. Right? The Soviets didn't expropriate Jews as such. They expropriated everybody. But in towns and cities in this part of Europe, the trading class and the professional classes were very largely Jewish, which meant that de facto the Soviets had already expropriated the Jews. And there's a political factor. The political factor is huge. The Soviets had eliminated the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian states entirely. Now, this is why the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is so hard, because the Lithuanians, and the Estonians, they don't want you to forget about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because it extinguished their sovereignty. They want you to know that it happened because they want you to know how bad the Soviet Union was. Okay, fine. But there's another reason why the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact matters so much, and that is that it prepares the way for what's going to happen next to Jews. Simple overall general claim. When a state is destroyed, this is worse not for the national majorities. The national majorities control the historiography. They're the ones who are going to tell you why it's bad later on. But in fact, it's worse for national minorities. The end of a state is worse for national minorities. And if you're not with me, just think for a minute about what's happening in Syria. The examples can be multiplied and multiplied. Okay? So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is actually most significant for Jews, and here's why. When the Germans enter into these territories, they find that they have opportunities that they did not know that they had. What they thought was going to happen, and this was kind of their Nazi naivete, was that the local inferior subhuman peoples were going to rise up against their Jewish communist masters and carry out lots of pogroms. Now, there were many pogroms. Every single one of them took place after the Germans arrived and instigated it in one way or another. Those pogroms were awful, but they did not lead in a straight line to the final solution. What happens instead is, in a way, much worse. What happens instead is that the Germans arrive in a situation where essentially everyone had been, this is the tricky political part, essentially everyone had been implicated in the Soviet project. The difference between the Soviet project and the Nazi project is that the Nazi project is racial. So it includes some, but it excludes most. The Soviet project, whatever its flaws, which I'm happy to discuss, is inclusive. It's about including everyone. When the Soviet Union expands, it brings what it has at home to you. It brings its same system to you. It equalizes, which means that as of 1941, to a degree that the Germans could not have understood and did not understand, local populations, whether they're Lithuanians or Jews or Russians, it doesn't matter, have been implicated in the Soviet system. Now, the Germans come punching into this territory with their Judeo-Bolshevik idea. Right? They come in here saying the Jews are communists and the communists are Jews. And that creates the opportunity for a politics which the Germans themselves don't understand and which you can't find in German sources, which is one of the major problems. You can find it in local sources and in Jewish sources because the Jews watch this and they're astonished and they write it down. What happens is that non-Jews, who are of course the majority of these Soviet collaborators, say, oh yes, of course, the Jews are communists and the communists are Jews, because that is their way out of their Soviet past, right? That is the thing which makes them safe under the German occupation. And that is the dynamic which allows Jews, regardless of how much they collaborated, to be punished and killed, okay? And then once Jews are killed for being communists, whether they were or not, very often by people who were communists, incidentally, when that happens, it then has to be true, you see? So once you kill Jews for being communists, then for generations to come, and I'm talking right up to the present, people then have to believe that the Jews were communists. Because the idea that you killed them for nothing, which is what happened, or the idea that you killed them for your own collaboration is unbearable, right? And from that source, we get the ethnic stereotypes that prevail today. Okay, that was a long explanation. There's another politics here which is really important. Imagine that an entire state which you are from is wiped out, right? Imagine that Canada is wiped out by America, France is wiped out, but just let your imaginations roam free, okay? It's not something that we generally have to deal with in the West, although it does happen in other places. What happens then is that a political resource is created, right? If Lithuania, for example, is destroyed, then there are going to be a certain number of Lithuanians who are going to be ready to collaborate with whatever is coming next, right? And the story that the Germans tell them is, these more educated, these more political collaborators, is the project we want you to collaborate with is the destruction of the Jews, and then all conversations about other politics follow that. Now, I'm not trying to remove responsibility from these people, and I'm not trying to say that the Soviets were worse and it was all their fault. What I'm trying to do is say the prior destruction of states is what makes that politics possible. If Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are not destroyed, then you can't have Lithuanians who are willing to collaborate. Generally, we call these people nationalists, and many of them were. But I would just point out that many of us would have a certain reaction if our state were completely destroyed by one of its neighbors. You don't have to be a nationalist to think that that's a bad thing and to believe that something ought to be done to restore it. So what happens then is that with the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the final solution then becomes a Holocaust. And I almost want to say finally becomes a Holocaust, because it's 8 years after Hitler has come to power. And a very particular thing has to happen. And what happens, to make it very brief, is that the Einsatzgruppen come through. They realize that local people can be recruited to collaborate. This is not part of the plan. There's no plan. Very important. There's no plan. There's never a plan. There's no plan. In fact, Hitler personally forbids arming local people, but they do it anyway within days. Local people can be recruited They can be recruited for these various political, economic, and sometimes anti-Semitic or nationalist reasons, that one can form militias, auxiliary police, and that one can kill the Jews. An opportunity emerges which hadn't been there before. And what the Germans realize is that this notion that the Jews can be eradicated has now taken on a form which they had not planned for, which they had not anticipated, and I think honestly they did not expect, which is that the Jews can be killed where they lived. The Germans learned this in practice. They learned it about locals, I've been emphasizing this, but they also learned it about themselves. They learned it about themselves. So when the Einsatzgruppen come in, there's no reason to doubt that they're going to follow orders. Their orders are, and this is important, to destroy the Soviet political class, just like their orders in 1939 in Poland were to destroy the Polish political class. The Soviet political class, though, is defined as being heavily Jewish. So when they come in, they're killing lots of people, but many of them are Jews of military age. This slips very quickly into being all Jews, right? And it slips partly because of the locals, but not entirely. It also has to do with the fact that the Germans turn out to be able to recruit themselves. So the Einsatzgruppen, when we're not thinking about the camps, we're thinking about the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen did not kill most of the Jews on the Eastern Front. The German order police, the uniformed police, the people who help you across the street, those people killed more Jews than the Einsatzgruppen. They were present at every major mass killing, and in the end of the day, they're probably more significant. The Wehrmacht also kills a very large number of Jews. The Germans did not know, the Nazi leadership did not know that their own people in conditions of statelessness, in these very special conditions of anarchy, could be brought in to this project. And that is how the Holocaust proves to be possible. It proves to be possible in this condition of double state destruction during the invasion of the Soviet Union because enough locals and enough Germans will take part. Now, this is important because in my view, it's the fact of killing which makes the final solution seem plausible. If we remember, the gassing facilities don't exist yet, okay? They don't exist yet. And they are a consequence of all this, not a cause. If we remember, there's no plan. There's not a plan. There's no plan about how this is to be done. This is learned in practice. And so it's the weight of the brute fact that 1 million Jews are murdered by December 1941, which makes a final solution seem plausible. Now, once you realize that, as Hitler seems very clearly to have done right around December 1941, once you realize that a final solution is possible in this way that you had not anticipated, well, then you press forward. You press forward into the pre-war Soviet Union, where very high percentages of Jews are killed, well over 90%, and you move backwards into Poland. And in Poland, also very high numbers, well over 90% of Jews are killed. The Jews are, remember, already gathered in ghettos, and they can be sent from the ghettos to gassing facilities. Now, the gassing facilities, just to make a point very briefly, the gassing facilities are not the result of some far-ranging plan. They are not the emanation of high technology or enlightenment or anything like that. They are the result of a series of improvisations designed to reduce the number of Germans who have to kill face to face. The Germans start gassing with vans in the east. They do it so they don't have to look at children while they're killing them. The technology involved is just shunting the exhaust pipe back into the hold of the van. That's not high technology, right? It's very easy. The next innovation, or technology if you like, technique, is that you park the vans. That's it. That's Helmno. That's the killing facility at Helmno. You park the vans, take the wheels off, put them on blocks. That's Helmno. The next innovation, high technology, not high at all, is that you take the internal combustion engine out of the vehicle. That's it. And then you pipe the exhaust into a sealed chamber. That's Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor. The next innovation after that is Auschwitz, where once you've realized you can use a sealed chamber, use hydrogen cyanide instead of exhaust. This is not high technology. Right? This is improvisation basically based on what's to hand. So it's the killing, as I see it, the crucial thing is the learning that this can be done. The technique is not so crucial. And when we get it backwards, what I'm trying to say is when we have this image of Auschwitz as some kind of end of history or modernity or some kind of black hole or some kind of poetic something or other, we're preventing ourselves from seeing this historically. Because Auschwitz is actually a kind of side effect of the Holocaust. It's not the Holocaust. It's one technique of carrying out the Holocaust. Very late. Okay. Now, the largest massacre that happens, or the first large-scale massacre which takes place, is at a town that you have not heard of, a city that you have not heard of, called Kamyanets-Podilsky. Kamyanets-Podilsky is in southwestern Ukraine. In Kamieniec-Podilsky at the end of August 1941, around 23,600 Jews are shot. Nothing like that had ever happened before in the history of the world. Unfortunately, things like that would then continue to happen. A few weeks later in Babi Yar, outside Kiev, 33,761 Jews would be shot. But it's Kamieniec-Podilsky which proved it was possible. And I want to dwell on this place because it reveals something important about this argument from the state. Thus far, what I've tried to claim is that it's the acceleration of the process of state destruction, the mutation of the German state, destruction of Austria, Czechoslovakia, increasingly violently Poland and the Soviet Union, which enables the Holocaust to happen. Let's now reverse the field and ask, how does the state protect Jews, or why is the state relevant to Jews? Kamieniec-Podilsky shows us something very important. When Czechoslovakia was destroyed, here comes obscure history, sorry. When Czechoslovakia was destroyed in 1938 and 1939, it was divided up into various bits. One of the bits was Subcarpathian Ruthenia, right? Subcarpathian Ruthenia is taken by Hungary. Hungary does not recognize the Jews in Subcarpathian Ruthenia as its citizens. When Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941, what does Hungary do? It expels those Jews from Subcarpathian Ruthenia eastward over the Soviet border right into the path of the Germans. And that is what prompts the massacre at Kamieniec-Podilsky. Now, the reason why I stress that is that it all begins with the destruction of Czechoslovakia. And it's possible because Hungary doesn't recognize the citizenship of its own Jews. And this is actually key, because whether we want to see this or not, and often we don't, the passport actually stops the bullet. The Germans' aspirations are total, and their achievements are horrifying. But what they will not do is kill Jews who are recognized as citizens by states. So other states take part in the Holocaust insofar as they depatriate their own citizens, and insofar as they expatriate they take citizenship away and send them away. That happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen always. Or to put this in a very general way, if you are a Jew on territory which was rendered stateless, your chance of surviving was less than 1 in 20. If you were a Jew on a territory where there was a state, your chance of surviving was 1 in 2, which is horrible. It's worse than anyone else in the Second World War, but it's very different, a whole order of magnitude different from 1 in 20. There are mechanisms for this, which I don't have time to describe. But the point is that once you move out of the zone of statelessness into the rest of Europe, it becomes harder. I'll just give you a couple of more very brief observations about this. Consider the following things. In Denmark, 99% of the Jews survive. There is a very pleasant story, which is fundamentally false, about how this happens. The main reason this happens is that the Danish occupation was a traditional military occupation in which Danish institutions were essentially untouched. If you want, we can go into how it actually happens in Q&A. In Estonia, 99% of the Jews are killed. Is Estonia more anti-Semitic than Denmark? No. If anything, clearly less so. The difference is, did Estonia take refugees in the 1930s? Yes. Did Denmark? No, and so on. But in Denmark, all the Jews die. Why? Because of the double occupation, because of the double state destruction. In France, 75% of the Jews survive. In the Netherlands, 75% die. Is that because the French are less anti-Semitic than the Dutch? No one thought so at the time, including the Jews. No one thinks so now. Right? Including historians. I mean, these are not just stereotypes. The reason why is that the Netherlands were the only country in Western Europe where the SS, where the state destroyers, were literally the guy who had destroyed Austria, Seyss Inquart, the state destroyers are in charge of the occupation, and that makes all the difference. Or consider the Holocaust in France. Here's something astounding, which I think every book on the Holocaust in France should begin with. More Polish Jews die in the Holocaust in France than French Jews. More Polish Jews die in the Holocaust in France than French Jews. And of course, there are many, 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 many more French Jews than Polish Jews. The reason why, in absolute numbers, more Polish Jews die is that they have no state protection, right? Which means that the French state is indifferent to their fate. In fact, they're the kind of people that the French state wants to get rid of. So if you look at it this way, each story is different, right? You have to tell the story of Hungary and Romania and Italy in detail. But the general rule is very clear. The more sovereignty there is, the better off the Jews are going to be. And roughly speaking, this is for 3 reasons, which I've already suggested. The first is citizenship. If you are a citizen and your state does not take your citizenship away, you're going to survive. The Germans are not going to take you as a Romanian Jew into Auschwitz in 1943 because Romania doesn't want you to go, so they won't take you. The second is foreign policy. If you're a sovereign state, you can decide that the Americans and the British care a lot about your Jews, which was not really as true as anti-Semitic governments thought it was, but you can decide the Americans and the British care a lot about your Jews, and you can switch sides, and to signal that you're switching sides, you can change your Jewish policy, which is what Romania did and what Hungary tried to do. The third thing which matters is bureaucracy. Now, in the literature on the Holocaust, and admittedly in everyday experience, bureaucracy has a bad name. But bureaucracy is not what killed the Jews. In Germany, the German bureaucrats never even decided to the end what a Jew was. The German bureaucracy does not kill any Jews inside Germany. The only way to kill Jews is to send them to bureaucracy-free zones, which you yourself have created. Where do the German Jews die? They die in Riga, they die in Minsk, they die in Łódź. They die in cities which before the war were thriving Jewish metropolises, but which German occupation transformed into the black holes that are described in German Jewish memoirs. We look at these cities through the lenses of the German Jews who go there, and we see them as places of death. But they were made into places of death by the destruction of the states around them. Okay. This, in turn, instructs us as to what rescue means. So I'm going to now try to tell you a very practical and I hope plausible account of how rescuing Jews was possible. If you've come this far, then you'll already know who the main rescuers are going to be. The main rescuers of Jews are diplomats. Why? Because diplomats are the people who are capable of giving you a piece of paper which gives you state recognition, right? So therefore, the Chinese consul in Vienna could rescue a couple thousand Jews. Therefore, Raoul Wallenberg, who was the only American anti-Holocaust policy because we paid for Wallenberg, he was an amateur Swedish diplomat who came to Budapest. He saved thousands of Jews by giving them transit papers. Or Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kaunas in Lithuania, also saved thousands of Jews by giving them transit papers. Diplomats were the people who could save, they were the only people, in fact, who could save very large numbers of Jews because they had the power to extend state recognition. When you move down from the diplomats, it becomes a little bit cloudier. Churches, sometimes yes, but usually no. And the churches who did, interestingly, were the churches who were marginal before the war. People who were oppressed before the war were more likely to rescue. Paramilitaries and partisan armies, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Right? There's nobody on the planet who likes both the Polish Home Army and the Soviet partisans, but in one fundamental way they were basically similar, which was sometimes they killed Jews and sometimes they rescued them because, to make it short, they were partially state institutions and partially not. When you work your way all the way down to individuals, to the people who in the book I call the righteous few, you find yourself in a very unusual zone. Because it turns out, and this is not surprising, though it's sobering, it turns out that people who can rescue without institutional support, surrounded by conditions of anarchy, when the incentive structures are all pointing towards giving Jews away or killing them, there are not very many people like that. And when you reach those people, you're actually reaching the end of the history, in a way. You're reaching the end of the story, because you're reaching into a place that you cannot explain structurally. Because these people are behaving in a way which you cannot account for by traditional motivation, right? There's a motivation is something that connects you to the outside world. This is not generally something these people have. They generally have something which the people who they rescued describe as humanity. That's a word which appears a lot, Menschlichkeit. Something which actually seems to go beyond the context. These tend to be people who take moral norms a little bit too literally, and therefore their hold on moral norms is less affected when the whole world around them changes. There are not that many people like that. Which brings me to the conclusion. If this account of the Holocaust is anything like correct, then we need to build much beyond the idea of following the rescuers and seeing them as an example. Because in the conditions in which the Holocaust took place, not many of us would be able to do that. I am not prima facie convinced that we are morally superior to the Europeans of the 1930s. I see very little evidence of that. In fact, when I look at the Europeans in the 1930s, I see the ability to defer gratification and do all kinds of things which we seem to have lost. So I think there's no particular case to make that we have learned. In fact, I'm extremely skeptical of that. I tend to think that we've learned the thing which is most convenient to us, which has to do with identity. And the problem with identity is the moment that times get tough, your identity changes and you forget your previous identity. You put someone else in a barn and burn them and you blame them for your previous identity and it's all over. That's what happens, not just to Poles in 1941, but to everybody. So I worry about identity as the lesson that we should learn. I worry even about ethics as the only lesson that we should learn. It seems like there are structural lessons, and there are two of them, and they're fairly clear. One of them is that this ecological panic is politics. We've been bracketed from that by the Green Revolution, right? We are the only people ever in the history of the world, not just us personally, but the people in the West of the last 3 generations are the only people in the history of the world for whom food has not been a political issue. What if that changes? Or what if the perception of that changes? And I don't mean just in America, but what if in a place like China? Right? What if in a place like China, which is already leasing 10% of the arable soil in Ukraine, and which is already in effect colonizing a great deal of East Africa? What about in a place like China? Is an idea of Lebensraum today so implausible for a place like China, an industrial power which is not able to secure its own food supplies and so on, right? What about in a place like China? Ecological panic can strike at many different levels. There's the local level, like Rwanda, Sudan, Syria, right? Syria today, now. There's a genocide going on in Syria now. And then there's the regional level, and then there's the global level, where I think China and Africa is perhaps a place to watch. The second lesson has to do with the state. Both from the right and from the left, we have drawn conclusions from the Holocaust which have to do with the need to weaken or fragment or limit the state. I think this is exactly backwards. The lesson of the Holocaust is that states protect, even imperfect states, even flawed states, protect citizens. And so as important as debates about what kind of state it should be and what the ideology should be, the state itself turns out to be a good. And so I would draw at least the very limited conclusion that wars like the American war in Iraq in 2003 or the Soviet war in Ukraine, or Russian war in Ukraine in 2014, which used the Holocaust as moral cover for destroying states, I'd make the minimal claim that that's a mistake, right? And I would make the maximal claim that bolstering states as a positive good or bolstering institutions which bolster states is probably a rather good thing. Now, these are the lessons that I would draw here, not because I think individual behavior is unimportant, right? That the rescuers have to be remembered, and I spent an awful lot of time in this book tracking down Yiddish sources, Polish sources, Russian sources, Ukrainian sources about rescue. A good deal of this book is devoted to rescue. It's not that I think that they're unimportant, it's that I think that they're all but unattainable, and that we have to be realistic about the historical setting. And being realistic about the historical setting means acting at moments when you can act, rather than waiting for that sensation of panic to come and the belief that you can't actually do things. That's what Hitler cultivated, that sense that you can do nothing except strike out, right? We are never very far away from that, but I think if we take the history of the Holocaust seriously, we can learn some of the mechanisms to keep our distance from that. So that's what I would take the public policy lessons of all this to be. Thank you very much. See, I mean, if you take the lecture seriously, you actually have to go out and change the world right away, right? That is the spirit of Yale undergraduates. That is what they are doing. Okay, so well, I'll start back there.
So I have a question about the role of the NSDAP, both in terms of the Holocaust and...
Sorry, the role of what? I missed it.
NSDAP, the
National Socialist, yeah, United Workers Party.
So in terms of Holocaust and both in terms of absorbing the state to the life, and what kind of role they play?
Yeah, so in the way that I narrate this history, it's very much an international history where I'm trying to take the standard narration where we spend an awful lot of time on Germany in the 1930s and then kind of spill over to the rest of the world without having previously examined it. I'm trying to turn that inside out and see what happens. So I'm putting, in the book, I put Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland and the Baltic states and the Soviet Union in play before they get destroyed. which is really important because then you have a sense not only of who the Jews are, where they lived, under what conditions, you also have a chance of understanding how important it is when those conditions go away. Which means that the way that I'm reading National Socialism is, of course, a little bit different because I'm reading National Socialism also internationally. So I'm reading National Socialism as I'm taking it seriously as a racial movement. And as a racial movement, it cannot entirely be about taking power in Germany or transforming the German state. It must be about international transformation. I'm taking that for granted, and I think that's a fruitful assumption. In terms of inside Germany, outside Germany, the National Socialist Party, and it's a good question because I just emphasized the SS, the National Socialist Party is not the kind of party which is just there to win power. They win power, but it can only be as an instrument to go further, right? So given what they believe the world is like, winning elections cannot be the end of the story. And Western observers who looked at Hitler and said, now that he's won power, he's going to calm down, they had to be wrong. In terms of the rest of Europe, the basic story in Eastern Europe, which is the crucial part, is that there are three kinds of occupations, roughly speaking. There's the civilian occupations, which are the civilian authorities, which are generally run by old guard Nazis. And then there's military occupation, which is out in front geographically of the civilian occupation zones. But then on top of that is the SS. And it's the SS which turns out to be most important. And there's a political story here, which I tell in this book and in the other one, about how it's easier for the SS to achieve its Nazi goals than it is for the party to achieve its Nazi goals. Because what the party is supposed to be doing is things like keeping order and extracting food, both of which turn out to be rather hard. Whereas what the SS is supposed to be doing is racial transformation. Some kinds of that turn out to be hard. All the kinds involving deportation, the Germans actually make a mess of deportation. They're terrible at it compared to the Soviets. But the parts that involve killing people where they live, the SS gets rather good at that. And then that's the mission they take credit for. So Himmler says, the East belongs to the SS. And this is what he means. They're actually able to carry out their mission faster than, and it seems like, silly, familiar bureaucratic infighting, and it was, but just with terrifying consequences. Another thing is like you can compare Poland with the East a little bit here, because the further east you go, the more authority the SS has. So like the end of the mass murder of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto is the moment where the civilian authority, which is also Nazi, gives way to SS authority, right? Okay, yeah.
So it's very compelling that statelessness is very dangerous and could be lethal to the national minorities. But isn't the overweening state dangerous and lethal to the national majorities, as the Soviet Union itself perhaps was, and maybe on a much smaller scale in Syria now? So it's a difficult choice. Who do we say that is the question?
Yeah. No, I'm obviously like making this, almost unbelievably conservative claim that like states are a good thing, right? Like I'm sort of thrown back into the 17th century with this argument, is obviously not a utopia, right? I'm not claiming that it exhausts everything that has to be said on the subject. I am saying though that if what one is concerned about is the physical extermination of minorities, then the state itself, especially insofar as the state recognizes those people as citizens, is a barrier. And that surprisingly, even flawed states, like even anti-Semitic states, this is a finding. Even anti-Semitic states are better than no state at all, right? So Germany, which you can't really deny is an anti-Semitic state, only manages to kill about half of its Jews, probably a little bit less. But in places where Germany goes and displaces state power, it manages to kill almost all of the Jews. Or Romania, which is indisputably an anti-Semitic regime, they kill less than half of their Jews, and they switch their policy. They shift from killing them to not killing them. And then there are other things which are interesting about this, like for example, where Jews die in Europe beyond the stateless zones, very often if you look closely, you see that it's something like a stateless zone. So in Bulgaria, for example, the Bulgarians have a story about how they saved their Jews, which is kind of true. But it's that the Jews who they sent to die were the Jews who were on the territory that they gained, right? So there was a regime change, which meant that there was a moment when those Jews didn't have citizenship, and then they were sent to Auschwitz and died, the Jews from Thrace, Macedonia. Even Romania. the Jews who were on Romanian territory at the beginning of the war, almost all of them survived. I mean, a couple tens of thousands, which is not trivial, die, but almost all survive. The Jews who die are the ones who are in territory which the Soviet Union takes, so regime change, and Romania takes back. And interestingly, when the Romanians go back into the Soviet Union, they tell the exact same Judeo-Bolshevik story that the Germans do, and they know it's not true. The Germans don't know it's not true. I mean, the Germans are naive on this stuff. The Romanians know it's not true, and they say it anyway. The Romanians come back and they tell Romanians who are trying to take revenge on Romanian communists, we are only taking revenge on Jews, because Jews are communists and communists are Jews. But I take your point, of course, and I mean, the way I would handle it in a broad way would be to say that the states which have proven to be capable of large-scale mass killing, very large-scale, like on the scale of millions, are party states. So unconventional states where the locus of political loyalty is actually beyond the state administration, and the state administration is seen as inferior to the party. So that would be People's Republic of China, Cambodia, and the Soviet Union. And then the other major finding. So what I'm saying about statelessness, actually, this is consistent with a huge set of findings from the genocide studies field and the ethnic conflict field, which has emerged since basically the war in Yugoslavia. So in the last quarter century, there have now been thousands of studies, and their basic finding is that it's conditions of civil war, regime change, and change of boundaries which favor ethnic cleansing. So what's special about Germany is that Germany is a party state, okay? But it's a party state which doesn't kill citizens, its own citizens so much. It's a party state which creates the conditions of political chaos beyond its own borders. So what's special about Nazi Germany is it brings together, like these two historical findings, that party states can kill lots of people and that state destruction kills lots of people. They're a party state which generates state destruction beyond their own borders. Now, it's not to say that there aren't bad states like Syria. It's not to say that there aren't abusive states. But it's even a place like Syria, where God knows it's hard to imagine how things could be worse. But even a place like Syria, so long as you're talking about an authoritarian regime that it's oppressing its own people, it cannot unleash a kind of international catastrophe of this sort. The only way to do that is to go beyond your own borders. And authoritarian regimes actually, they don't necessarily do that. Okay, so Jen, you had a question.
Yeah, so in the last chapter of the book, you make this really striking statement that globalization brings a specific intellectual danger. And you note that Hitler was a child of the first wave of globalization in the late 19th century. We're all products of the second wave, or a second wave of globalization in the late 20th century. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the argument that you're making about the intellectual and indeed political dangers of globalization.
Right. So the first point you've already made, which is that globalization is not new. It's not new. We can study it because it already happened once. Hitler's generation was a globalized generation. The thing which the Germans called Welthandel in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, up to the First World War, basically, with the digging of canals, right, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the expansion of world trade, at a dramatic rate, the late Victorian prosperity, which one sees so clearly in English literature from the period. These things were globalization. These were globalization, and like any globalization, here's my answer to your question, globalization tends to bring about mental shortcuts because we can't really handle that level of analysis, right? We can handle a few people, a group, a nation we can do, but that's like a big step of imagination, which already requires a lot of abstraction. But the whole planet, right? The whole planet begs for shortcuts. And the idea that the Jews are in charge is one shortcut. Right, it's one way of organizing the planet, and it's one which many people found, unfortunately, quite convincing. Now, when I say there's a specific danger, I mean that in a world which isn't globalized, where Hitler's not thinking about housewives in America, then because Hitler was a global thinker. I mean, that's a kind of like I sound like I don't know, Hillary Clinton when I say global thinker, because global is a word now that has entirely positive connotations, right? Or almost, am I right about this? When you say global, you mean something good, like the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. You mean something good when you say global, right? You mean positive, cosmopolitan, forward-thinking. Jim Levinson's already gone, I'm in good shape. You mean something forward-thinking, positive, over the horizon. But global is dangerous too. I mean, Hitler was a global thinker. Okay, so I didn't talk about this very much. I only referred to America. But Hitler thought about the whole world. I mean, he thought that the American frontier experience was a positive model for Germany, and he wasn't alone. I mean, 2 whole generations of German colonialists thought that. The Germans who colonized Africa, they referred to America all the time. When they were exterminating African peoples, they said, "This is necessary. Look at America." Right? They referred to their own colonies as our Wyoming. Right? They referred, yeah. I mean, not only I don't mean to pick on Wyoming. That wasn't the only. They also mentioned Montana and some other states. But they saw the American model as part of one history, right? As part of one history. So a little Hitler would play cowboys and Indians, and he would play at African wars, right? And in a way, it was the same thing, right? It was the same thing. A little Hitler would read Karl May. I don't mean what he did, like millions of other German children, would read Karl May about the American West, take that in, and also read the newspapers about African wars, and it was all one story for him. So that globalization was about colonialism, and that's the lesson that people learned, right? And when Hitler was thinking about Lebensraum, he was thinking globally. He was thinking the British control, he thought like this: the British like free trade, because they're the only ones who can control the sea lanes, because they have a big navy, which is all totally true. He says, the British are the ones who support free trade because they're the only ones who would be able to fight their way out of it if there's not a problem. Also totally true, right? But that is a global thinking. And his reaction to that is, Lebensraum, we have to become a third great power after the British, after the rising Americans. We have to become a third great power. He's thinking at the level of the planet, which is what Carl Schmitt, your friend and mine, rising star of this befuddles me, but rising star of the international left right now, Carl Schmitt. This is what Carl Schmitt said, that we all think in planetary terms now, right? We all think in planetary terms. So what I mean is that globalization raises the level of complexity to such an extent that people look for shortcuts. And they look for examples which sometimes they mutate a little bit when they apply them to their own territory. Yes, please.
When Hitler was writing about his idea that the national order of things, natural order of things would be racial warfare over resources, did he talk about how he envisioned the races, or who would be the races battling one another?
Yeah, interestingly, he was much vaguer on that question than one might think. There is an Aryan race, and the Aryan race, says Hitler, is responsible for most of the good inventions, whether it's art, whether it's science. He says that they're responsible for most of the progress, but it's a little bit unclear who they are, where they came from, who they are now. He doesn't mean the Germans. He means the Germans plus, like maybe the Dutch and the Scandinavians. It's not just the Germans. When he talks about the Germans, he talks about the German folk, the German people. What's interesting is that he thinks the German people, the folk, their nationalism, like this is it's this thing to be exploited. They're nationalists, so you use that to send them into war against Poland. And you tell them it's all about Danzig or it's all about the borders, but it's not at all about those things. It's about destroying the Polish state and beginning a racial war. But anyway, to answer your question, he's much less clear about that. But I mean, there's a way in which his clarity actually makes a kind of sense, because his view of races was entirely pragmatic and so kind of post factum, because he thought races always struggle and the victorious races are the victorious races. So it's kind of circular, right? Which led to the famous, or notorious moment at the end of the war when he says, well, the Germans have lost, so it turns out they're not actually such a superior race. The history now belongs to, he says, the younger peoples of the East. So, so his view is like, okay, I made a mistake, but I was fundamentally right. It's all about racial struggle. I just was wrong about the Germans. And that's a way that he's incidentally not a nationalist, right? Because I think no nationalist could say, I just made a mistake and destroyed my own people, right? But that's to the good in the end, because this is all a big laboratory experiment about which races are stronger. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more, and then okay, I'll take 3 more. All right. So maybe Jenny, you first.
Yeah, I have a question about logical consistency in this planetary ideology. I'm just wondering how you square what seems to be a conflict, namely, on one hand, the motto that you began your talk with, that race shouldn't sacrifice its goals on the altar of the state, the idea that the revolution should devour itself, the state should devour itself in the name of international nation. How do you square that with the idea of the SS or Nazi reference for state protection of the Jews? It seems to argue that the passport stopped the bullet, and the Nazis were willing to recognize the boundaries of the state when it came to protecting the Jews. It seems like the Judeo-Bolshevik myth should win out in that kind of a scenario, and I'm wondering how you square that.
Okay, so first of all, let's recognize, even without my big claims at the beginning of the talk, let's recognize how interesting it is that the passport did stop the bullet. I mean, that's something that I think you could start a whole history of the Holocaust from that claim, and you would end up with a very different kind of trajectory than the ones that we usually have. And it's true. I mean, the Germans had the hardest time depatriating their own Jews. It took them, they made them second-class citizens, they took away some of their property rights, they eventually got many of them out, but within their own state, they couldn't just take all the passports away. They couldn't even do that, right? Which raises the question of just how powerful the state was or how complete Nazi control was. They couldn't find a way to do that within the state. The only way to do it was to get those people physically into a bureaucracy-free zone somewhere in the east. And so what I'm saying is that the Nazis fundamentally believed that the truth about the world was the racial struggle. But in the racial struggle, people did have instruments. Right? It's not that they didn't believe in, it's not that Hitler literally didn't believe in science, right? I mean, he believed in artillery. He even believed in agricultural technology. He just didn't believe that it could change the fundamental condition of the world, which was racial struggle. And so it's not that the Germans or the Nazis denied that states existed. It's that they thought states are fundamentally a means rather than an end, and in the end will all be overcome. But in the meantime, you can't pretend that states don't exist any more than you can pretend that the enemy's artillery doesn't exist. It's out there. The Nazis are perfectly aware that if they killed American Jewish citizens who happened to be tourists, that very bad things would happen as a result of that. So you're right that I don't think it's actually a contradiction. I mean, they would have wanted a world in which all states collapsed into some kind of racial competition. I think they would have wanted that world, or all states were subordinate to races, something like that. But in the meantime, Hitler was perfectly aware of the constraints he faced. And that's true all the way through the story. I mean, your question highlights something which is true all the way through the story, which is that when Hitler needs to win elections, he's perfectly aware of what he's facing in terms of public opinion, right? That's how he comes to power. When Hitler has to transform the German state, he's perfectly aware of how slow he has to go. He doesn't jump for joy in March of 1933 and say, I'm going to wave my hand to make it all go away. He slowly transforms this bit, that bit, and the other bit. And I think it's the same with foreign states. He knows that they're real, even though that, in his worldview, eventually they should all collapse. In the meantime, they're real, and you have to deal with them. I mean, this is I think this is just really, I think it's really interesting. And in a way, that's the paradox in both domestic and foreign policy, right? How do you come to power when you're a racial anarchist? He solves that. How do you kill lots of Jews once you start the war? He also solves that. I mean, not completely, but he finds a way to solve it, which is you create zones where there is no sovereignty. I mean, or to put it a different way, if statehood weren't a problem, then he wouldn't have to destroy states. But I'm answering this abstractly, but what they learn in practice. They actually learn that you can get rid of Jews as states collapse. They learn that in practice, but that doesn't mean that states have collapsed everywhere. Okay, I said two more, right? So how about Stephen and then Carolina?
Thank you, Senator. It was a wonderful presentation. Can you draw any parallels between Hitler's political philosophy that you described and present-day political leaders such as Vladimir Putin?
Well, I would hesitate to do that, but fortunately President Putin does it himself, right? So he has embarked on a nostalgia campaign about the 1930s, which leads right up to and includes the idea that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a pretty good thing. So rather than my doing it, I just prefer to kind of sit and listen, because what he is saying, and I think this is a very important claim for Europeans, is that things like European Union or any kind of transnational law, those things don't really matter. The real world, the good world, the world that, real men want, is the world of the 1930s, right? When nations were nations and men were men. That's what he wants. And so he's right up to the point where he says Stalin and Hitler were rational actors who were just doing what power does. So I don't like the idea of parallels, but I don't mind pointing out that Putin has rehabilitated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact twice, once in front of his own local historians and the second time in front of Chancellor Merkel. So I'll just leave it at that. And then Carolina, and then I want to make sure everyone can get home before midnight.
Okay, so mine's a little bit more specific, but I was wondering how you would, or how you do fit the Polish underground state into this narrative. So a state that's far away abroad, but an apparatus that still works on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And in the book, I spent a lot of time on these quasi-state apparati precisely because it's so important, because you're on this continuum, right? So you say the Polish state, when I say the Polish state's destroyed, but it's not quite destroyed. There are places in the countryside where it's utterly transformed, and then there are like neighborhoods or maybe even individual apartments where in some sense it functions. And the case I try to make is that where Polish Jews are saved or helped, it is surprisingly often the result of the reach of that very weak and distant Polish state. And the two examples are Żegota, which is, so there aren't actually that many policies by European states to save Jews. Like America had one, the Poland had one, and it was called, Żegota was a code name for a government organization which unified and funded people who already in Warsaw had been trying to help Jews in hiding. And it was, the money incidentally came from the Joint. So the way that Żegota worked was that the Polish state was in action because it was Polish paratroopers dropped by British planes over Polish territory, occupied Polish territory, with in their money belts cash, which came from American Jews from the Joint. And then that was then delivered to Żegota, which was a Polish government institution in Warsaw, also in other cities, and used to try to help the several thousand Polish Jews who were in hiding. So probably, a few thousand Jews were saved as a result of that, and that was actually a government policy. The second thing which is worth mentioning is the Allied warnings of December 1942, January 1943 to Germany's allies not to continue the persecution of Jews. There were other warnings, but that was included. Those were in some measure a result of information that came through Polish state channels. So this is what Jan Karski, who's remembered as an individual, but Jan Karski was working for the Polish state. He was a courier working for the Polish state. He was on an official mission. He wasn't a private individual. And his information brought from Warsaw although Karski himself didn't think so and lived in guilt his entire life, had an effect on British public opinion, on the British Parliament, and on the level of knowledge of world leaders. It led to BBC reports, it led to stories in the Times of London, and it was one of the things which led to official Polish government in exile statements about the events we now call the Holocaust, which in turn contributed to the Allied warnings. And those Allied warnings didn't affect Germany at all, for the reasons that we discussed. The Nazis didn't care about the state or the nation, but they did affect other states, right? So for example, Sweden was probably made more likely to accept the Danish Jews by these statements, right? Governments were probably more inclined to switch sides as a result of this. So in that way, although it's very indirect, the existence of a Polish state actually helps. So it's like everywhere you find a Polish state, it ends up making a positive difference. Although the total picture in Poland and German occupation is one of anarchy and fragmentation, and that's a story that I tell at length in the book. Okay, I promised I would let the rest of you go. If you want a book, there are books. I can't give them to you, but I can sell them to you for, Sarah can sell them to you for, if you have a $20 bill, you can leave with a book. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the discussion.